Hello, kind people. This is Peter Svidler with the recap of the fourth round of the Altibox Norway chess tournament going on in Stavanger right now. And for this video, I've chosen the pairing of the ex-world champion Vishy Anand playing the white pieces against the world number 3 and the Chinese number 1 Liren. Neither of them were doing particularly well in the tournament prior to this. Liren was doing fine, Vishy less so. The tournament was led at the 3-round mark by Magnus Carlsen, but after Vishy on the rest day confirmed his title as the best cook among the elite chess players, the feeling was he will be reinvigorated and excited to play chess again, and he did not disappoint. So let's have a look at the game. Let me just get into the frame as usual. More into the frame. There we go. As mentioned, Vishy was white and he went for 1a4, which is his main weapon, although obviously he can make any move on move 1. e5, knight f3, knight c6, and here the Gioco Piano, where Ding has a very specific repertoire against the Gioco Piano these days. So I guess in particular the attraction of this line for Vishy was in the fact that he can prepare he can more or less with pinpoint precision prepare for a very specific position of the Italian, because the Italian is such a huge beast these days that it really helps to know your client well enough to be able to prepare for a specific thing instead of the entire body of work which this opening requires. Knight f6, d3, bishop c5, castles, c3, d6, h3, a5. Ding is one of those people who does not even attempt to stop bishop g5 in these positions. And he does go for this setup with a5 and h6, which has become reasonably popular in recent times and has been played by a number of very strong players. So I think Vishy had every right to expect this. Rook e1, h6, knight bd2, bishop e6, bishop b5, and here this move queen b8, which the intention is quite clear. Black wants to play queen a7 and fight against the d3, d4 break. And also a5, a4 is a useful positional idea in these types of positions, further making sure that white doesn't get anywhere at all on the queen side. Knight f1, queen a7, and here Vishy played d4. There are two other moves you can make here. Magnus Carlsen himself against Ding in St. Louis in 2017 played bishop e3 here. Black generally takes, goes knight e7, and most people don't lose these positions with black. The game between Carlsen and Ding ended in a draw, and in fact Ding at some point was even slightly better here. And the same applies to the game between Dominguez and Hikaru Nakamura, played in St. Louis in 2018. I did lose this position to Sergei Karyakin, not finishing on the podium in the World Blitz due to that loss, but that's me. What can you do? And apart from that, there is also the move Rook e2, which I myself made in a Grand Prix game in Palma de Mallorca against Pavel Ilyanov, but in general the position after a4 should be quite good for black, and the very spectacular and very quickly played game between Shahmat Midyarov and Sergei Karyakin in Stavanger 2018 confirms that black probably is doing completely fine here. Vishy, instead of all that, goes d3, d4 here. There is one more option available to white in this position, but we'll come to that slightly later. Vishy goes d4, e takes d4, and bishop takes e6. This has been played recently by a friend of the show, Jorgen van Foreest, and against him black played bc6, cd4, and bishop b4. White is slightly better here. It's a safe enough position. It's maybe not very much, but white definitely will enjoy this. And instead of that, Ding blitzes out d takes e3. The bishop, of course, has to go back. Bishop takes f2, king h2. And here he started thinking quite seriously, which was a little bit interesting because obviously both Vishy and Ding had this position sort of prepared. At least, I mean, with Vishy you have to suspect maybe he looked at this even this morning. And Ding clearly also knows quite a bit about this line, and you don't play ed4, dc3 and bishop takes f2 without knowing at least a little bit about it. But here he paused and he ended up making a move d6, d5, which is very, very interesting, but I don't think it's the machine's first line. The machine does suggest that taking on e1, it is a rook you can take with the bishop, which is normally good. Queen takes e1, and in this position, of course, not the naive cb2, bishop takes b2, after which white has tremendous potential for attacks on the king side, and black is instantly significantly worse. In this position, black has a choice between the immediate d6, d5, sort of as in the game, but having taken on e1, which should be in black's favor in some cases, or a very tricky looking move, queen c5, which I think, I mean, at the depth where I kind of stopped clicking, because this position you can definitely immerse yourself for a couple of days in this position, and you still will feel that you haven't exhausted all the possibilities. Queen c5 is an interesting move. It stops white from consolidating with bishop c2, which is sometimes relevant. And it creates, I think, the biggest threat here is shown after white, let's say, makes a move like knight g3, queen b4 here is very, very strong, attacking the bishop on a4 and the pawn on b2. So white is more or less obliged to take on c3, and now we play d6, d5. And this position, once again, I did not spend more than maybe 10-15 minutes trying to understand what's happening here. Black is definitely fine according to the computer, but whether black has much more than comfortable equality is unclear. Instead of that, as mentioned, Ding played d5, and Vishy made what the computer suggests is an inaccuracy. He played e5. It was better to take on d5 once again at the very, very surface level that I analyzed this position. e5, and now rook e5, regardless of which piece black chooses to take. The computer suggests knight takes d5 is slightly stronger than bishop takes d5. After bishop d5, rook e5, black has either the immediate move c7, c6, with some ideas of playing queen b8 later on in particular, and also black can start with b5, which at first kind of shocked me, but the point is c6 is such an important part of black's repertoire here that winning a tempo to play c6 whilst attacking a piece is extremely strong. And after b5, white is very strongly advised not to take on b5 and to go back to c2 with a completely messy position. I will not even attempt to evaluate. But as I said, knight takes d5, I think the machine prefers slightly. And after rook e5, you have to make a somewhat weird looking move, queen b6. I mean, have to is maybe strong, but the alternative is to play rook a d8. I think the move most of us would make in this position, after which white can finally take, and some kind of a position like this appears on the board, which is maybe probably slightly better for white. Not earth-shattering advantage, but it's more comfortable to play this with white. After queen b6, the difference is if you take on c3 and play queen c2 here, bishop d4 becomes a lot stronger. And for this, I have to scroll back sort of to the position after rook a d8, takes, queen c2. If black plays bishop d4 here, also seems very strong, seems exactly like the previous position, only with the rook on d8. But that's not true. White can play bishop e3 here, and if you take on e5 with check, white takes on e5, and the queen on a7 is too far away to protect the knight on c3. So this is actually quite bad for black. Whereas in this position, if you try doing the same, black obviously has the move queen b4, which is a very relevant detail. So after queen b6, white, for instance, plays bishop b3. And once again, black just completely nonchalantly plays bishop f2, c5, despite the fact that seemingly the knight on d5 is hanging. And the point is, if white takes like this, seemingly keeping the pawn on b2 under control, black just plays a5, a4, re-establishing the threat of c3 takes b2, and black is much better. This, once again, is a horribly messy position. I can't really give you an evaluation of. I have still no idea what's happening here. The machine suggests it's a mess that black is reasonably fine in, but I would need more time to be entirely convinced of this. All in all, I think e5 gives white an actual chance to fight for advantage, whereas after Vishy's move e5, knight e4, black is immediately very, very comfortable. Vishy played bishop e3, obviously with the intention of meeting bishop takes with rook takes, cb2, rook b1, and the rook does not allow black to play knight c3. But Ding correctly played c7, c5 here, and at this point it is only really black that plays for a win, because black's pawns are very mobile in the center. He has 3 for the piece. And also the pawn on b2 will cost white more than you would expect. Takes, takes, queen c2. It's not better to play queen e2 instead, because I briefly considered this during the live broadcast. Black still plays c takes b2 and c4, protecting the knight and also creating this d3 square for it. White can play bishop c2 here, but he is immediately in a lot of trouble after c3. This is just too strong, you cannot allow this. Because of which, white just played queen c2, takes, rook b1, c4, queen b2, knight d3, queen c3, takes, and took with the rook. And we come to this weird situation where white has 2 pieces for rook and 3 pawns, but because this pawn is on b7 and not on b4, white seemingly has at least some time to try to establish some kind of a blockade with knight d4, knight e3, and if you do give white time to make all these moves, white probably will be significantly better. But black, of course, will have something to say about it. Queen c5. The threats are b5 and also, very importantly, queen b4, which is why knight d4 is not a move you can make. You have to play rook b1. And here the computer has 2 suggestions which it says are stronger than what Ding played. One is rook fd8, which you can sort of understand. d5, d4 is too strong, you have to stop it. And then black plays bishop d7, bishop c2, b5. The machine says there is no mate on the king side, and black just starts sort of overrunning the white position on the queen side. So it goes bishop b5, just to sort of physically stop the b7 from its run. And then black plays queen e7, and it turns out it's kind of tricky for white to keep all of these things in balance. For instance, if you go rook e1 here, you probably more or less lose to bishop b5, knight b5, and once again queen b4. Your blockade crumbles, and black probably will queen all of his queenside pawns. So that's one opportunity, and the other one is even more striking. You can apparently play b7, b5 here. After bishop takes b5, black starts playing against that bishop, like rook b8, bishop d7, for instance. And if you take with the rook, black has the move queen f2, attacking the knight. In some cases, hinting at attacking the pawn on a2, and most importantly, after something like knight g3, black goes rook fb8. And it turns out that the computer values opening up the b file for the rooks a lot higher than the backward pawn on b7. Ding did not spot that opportunity, and the game sort of went off the rails for him a little bit here. He went bishop f5. Vishy, of course, does not take on b7 here, because as we just explained, giving black rooks the b file is counterproductive at the very least. Rook b5, queen c7, knight e3, bishop b4, and here the computer actually suggests that with a precise move, white would have been better here. But the precise move is very difficult to make. You have to play queen d4 here, blockading things mainly, and not really creating any immediate concrete threats, but just mainly taking things as much under control as possible. And after c3, you don't play rook c5, which after queen b6 leads to the positions that the machine assesses once again, due to the returning idea of queen b4 as equal. But you take on d5 with the rook. And after bishop takes d5, knight takes d5, queen d8, queen e4, the pawn on c3 will fall, and the computer says this is significantly better for white. Not winning, but white is definitely the side with the advantage in this position. Instead of that, Vishy made a reasonably normal looking move knight d2, which we also sort of expected during the game. And Ding, after some very prolonged thought, during which I'm sure he considered rook a d8 and also rook f d8, he went for a very specific line where a lot of pieces get traded off the board. The computer suggests that the best move in this position is d5, d4, something we also considered during the live show. Queen has to take on d4, we play bishop c6, white takes on c4. And here the machine suggests it's important not to start with bishop takes b5 first, but play rook a d8. Because after knight d6 it gives black additional options, maybe f7, f6 can be considered in some positions. It looks horribly risky, but on the other hand the white pieces are also slightly up in the air. And after rook a d8 the machine goes, let's say, queen g4, takes, queen c5, or queen h4 with similar ideas, and all of these positions end up being draws. So d4 would have equalized properly. Instead, Ding goes rook a e8, going specifically for the following operation. Knight takes e4, queen takes, rook takes, bishop c2, very important move, using the fact that the pawn on d5 is pinned to make it very difficult for black to win the material back for now. f5, knight takes c4, and rook e7. And currently white has even 3 light pieces for the rook, but obviously one of the knights will die. And we end up in positions where it is white who will have some pressure, but black should probably make a draw in most cases. I will only really glance at some critical moments for the remainder of the game, because the game continued for an additional 76 moves, and there have been a number of sort of variation changes through that, but the video would be just interminably long if I did the full game. The computer suggests it's slightly more precise to start with knight e3, but we expected Vishy to do what he did. Takes, and knight e3. This also looks perfectly sensible. Black goes b6, rook b5, rook b8. And here I think there's definitely an argument to be made for not trying to win the e4 pawn straight away, but to bring your king over to, let's say, f2, e2, maybe in some positions. But knight f5, which is what Vishy played, is also fine, because it wins the pawn on e4 straight away. Black plays rook c5. Here it makes sense to once again say something that we kept on returning to during the live shows. When you have this material balance on the board, rook and light pieces against the 2 rooks, it is very, very important for the side with the light pieces not to trade the rooks off. Because simply 2 light pieces, in particular bishop and knight, 2 bishops are less problematic, but bishop and knight don't really fight well against a single rook without the rook to support them. So Vishy, of course, doesn't take on c5. And in this position, I think you can make an argument that this is where significant advantage slipped away, because I think if he goes knight h4 here, stopping the rook from going to d4, black probably will struggle to shift the pawn from b6 to b4. Instead, Vishy played knight g3, rook d4, bishop e2, rook b4, rook d3, b5, and this probably has to be closer to equality, even though the computer continues to suggest that white is the side with the potential advantage. Bishop h5, king h7, rook d6, rook g5. Here the machine goes rook e6, but once again, players were obviously playing on fumes for somewhere around here already in terms of the time left, because as you probably know by this point in this tournament, there is a slight increment after move 40. Players get, I think, 10 seconds increment for each move, but there's no time added, so it is still the remainder of your 2 hours that you have to operate on here. And of course mistakes started creeping in. Vishy played bishop e2, king g8, bishop d3, king f8, knight b5. Knight f5. Ding probably also could have played slightly more precisely somewhere around here, because after rook b2, bishop b4 and g6, rook f6 and king e8, the computer suggests that there's really no reason whatsoever not to take on h6 here. I guess Vishy didn't want to start some kind of a race like this, but as a matter of fact, h3, h4 is very, very strong here. Rook c5, bishop takes g6, and then the knight will vacate the h6 square and the h-pawn will run. And this actually is quite significantly better for white. I will hesitate to call this position completely winning, but white becomes a significant favorite. Instead, Vishy played bishop c6 check, and the king got out of the corner, and the pawns were traded. And we got to a position like this, which of course should be quite easily drawn, but white shouldn't really run any risks. But eventually things started going slightly wrong, and 20 moves later we got to a situation like this. where more pawns got exchanged, but the a-pawn got all the way to a3 and is supported by the rook. And Vishy decided not to even engage in some kind of a position like this, where if you suddenly blunder something, you might not be able to give up a piece for the rook, and took a very practical decision of playing rook c2 and rook c1, and this position is quite a straightforward draw, and draw was indeed agreed some 25 moves later. With that result, the players resumed their contest in the Armageddon format, with Vishy having 10 minutes and the white pieces yet again, versus 7 for Ding, and Ding having the draw odds. And they repeated the entire opening. Once again, we will briefly show you the moves without really going too much into detail. The exact same move, well, slightly different move order, but the exact same position reached by move 12. And here Vishy made a move queen d2, which also has been played once, I believe, in the game between Dominguez and Vidit, which, hang on a second. It's slightly awkward for me that I remember that Vidit was playing black, but it's a bit embarrassing for me not to remember who was white in that game. So let me just take a second, and I don't want to lie to you. It is actually Dominguez versus Vidit, so I could have saved myself the embarrassment there a little bit, but it's always pays to make sure. And Vidit played a4 here, to which Dominguez replied by taking on c6 eventually and going for some kind of a knight g3, knight h4, knight hf5 plan. The queen on d2 looks extremely weird, but it also supports all these plans quite well, because this battery supports all kinds of sacrifices on the king side. It was a very, very sharp game in which I have a feeling Liren at some point was doing exceptionally well, but he ended up losing. Instead of all that, Dingo just goes rook a d8 here, saying I don't really want to get involved with any of this. Knight g3, knight e7, d4, bishop b6, and Vishy goes queen c2. Now, this appears to be a pawn sacrifice, but if black actually takes on d4, white can play bishop b3. Of course, the point is not to play queen takes c7 and lose after queen d4. White plays bishop b3, black goes to b4. The bishop goes all the way back to f1, I suspect. Now the queen on b4 is in some trouble, so black goes c5 to at least make sure that there's a square on b6. And now the bishop gets shunted over to the long diagonal. And the computer, despite seemingly black having an extra pawn and no real threats right now for white, immediately prefers this for white, because there's a lot of play against the black queen side, and also something like queen d2 will create very unpleasant tempi for white attacking the pawn on a5. So Ding just ignores all that and goes knight g6, bishop e3, c6, bishop d3, rook f8. And we get a very, very typical position you often get in Gioco Pianos, where white manages to push d3, d4, and black in reply just does sort of a symmetrical development, and the only difference is, of course, the white has 2 pawns in the center versus 1 for black. And the computer, because the pawn on e2 sometimes actually hangs in these positions, suggests playing something like a2, a4 here at first, with the intention of playing rook a d1, and then we will once again kind of rethink our options. Maybe sometimes white plays for trying to push c3, c4, sometimes some other plans come in. But Vishy was really in no mood to fool around at all. He just goes queen d2 here, seemingly improving black's options of playing d6, d5 because of the x-ray along the d-file. And more or less without hesitation, Vishy takes on h6. And it wouldn't entirely stun me if it turned out that this was kind of plan B for today, and Vishy and his team actually looked at this. Because at first the computer is quite skeptical, and then it starts saying, yeah, this is extremely playable and actually might be very, very good for white. I think the best option that I was able to establish here is to take on d4 twice, and then white just goes bishop g5, d, and knight takes e4. And despite all the x-rays I kept on mentioning, the initiative white gets on the king side just outweighs all that. Black, I think, is supposed to play bishop d5 here, and you get some kind of a position like this, where black is by no means lost, but also I think you're pretty sure that you're at least slightly better for white with white here. Ding, on the other hand, decided not to do that. A brief mention has to be made that this position is already completely lost because the simple threat, let's say, of knight f5, bishop f5, ef is more or less impossible to parry. The black pieces are just too far away from the theater of actions and black gets mated. Ding took on e4, knight e4, knight e4, and here Vishy made a mistake. A slightly uncharacteristic one because he was calculating very cleanly on the day, but the move he chose here is not the best one. It was simple, quite good to take on e4 with the bishop. Of course, f5, queen g5 is more or less immediately obvious that this is very good for white. But I'm sure Vishy didn't quite like the move e takes d4. But you can sort of ignore the counterplay in the center and just play queen g5 here. And here already, let's say if you take on c3, bishop takes g6, this is mate. Black is nowhere near in time here with his bishop takes f2 counterplay. And as a matter of fact, the computer makes a very weird looking move rook d5 and suggests it might be the only option black has. Somewhat surprisingly, you're not supposed to take here because after bishop d5 cd, it turns out that the bishop on h6 continues to be captured. It will get picked up reasonably soon, and white actually traded off his best attacker. So instead of all that, the computer says play queen g3 first. Black takes, we take on g6. Black has queen b8 here. A very, very important resource, attacking the queen on g3. And if you take on b8, most of your advantage disappears. But here white has a very, very beautiful geometric idea. You can take on e6 here. Black obviously cannot take on e6 with the rook because you lose a queen. And you also cannot take on g3 first because white has an intermediary check and ends up being a full rook up. Because of all that, you have to take on e6, and white goes queen g4. This square, as you may have noticed, was not available prior to our little combination, and it's very, very important for white to keep the queen on g-file and also not to allow black to trade queens. So rook e6, fe, queen g4, and the combined threats of bishop takes e8, discovered check, in some cases bishop e4 takes d5, makes this position very, very bad for black. Instead of all this, Vishy took with the rook, and now black is sort of fine. And in fact, he could have actually made white play conservatively by playing bishop f5, which probably would have forced Vishy to play bishop g5, bishop e4, bishop takes e4. And this position, which could also have happened in the game, is maybe slightly better for white after something like rook d6, bishop g6. You're supposed to take with the rook, g5, and here the computer makes a weird looking move, bishop c7. Attacking the pawn on e5. It looks like it blunders a piece, but it doesn't actually because the queen comes back into the fray. And the evaluation here kind of hovers around 0. It's not horrible for white by any means, but it's very playable for black as well. But instead of bishop f5 in this position, Ding played bishop d5. Once again, bishop g4 obviously transposed to the same position. But Vishy was in no mood to switch to positional play. He goes rook g4. Black, of course, plays e4, and here Vishy goes knight h4. Continuing the same policy of no pieces going back. You could, after e4, play c3, c4, switching to, once again, some kind of positional play, but Vishy was in no mood. Knight h4, he takes d3. White has a draw here if he wants, after takes, rook d7, and simply, let's say takes, and queen g5 check. There is definitely a perpetual here available to white. But obviously he doesn't want. Why would he want a draw in a game he absolutely has to win? So Vishy continues in the same sacrificial manner. He goes knight f5 here. And when this happened live on air, I said, yeah, this looks very beautiful, but I don't believe it's any good, and immediately named bishop e6 as a move that, quote-unquote, refutes the whole point of white's previous play. I was, as it turns out, correct about the evaluation of this position, and also completely wrong as to why it's not good. Black has a winning advantage here, but the way to get there is, I think, extremely difficult to spot in severe time trouble. Black is supposed to play rook e2 here, force the queen to g5, and then just play d3, d2 as if nothing is happening on the king side. bishop takes g7. And here, rook e1 check is quite strong, but apparently even stronger is a quiet move, bishop b6, c7, creating the threat of rook e1 followed by mate, because we took out the h2 square from white. And this position is just completely winning for black. Although, once again, the variation after bishop e5, let's say rook e1 check first, king h2, bishop takes e5, de, and queen takes f2. This, I think, is possible to find, even though you will notice that black has to just completely abandon the rook on d8 with check. But the thing is, black gives mate first. There's no defense against queen g1 check here, and I think the evaluation here is mate in 11. So this works out. But after bishop c7, f4, which I think what would have been played in the game had this occurred in the game, I think black is supposed to make maybe even the only winning move, queen a7, b6. And once you get into this territory, I think it's quite safe to assume that the refutation is not easy. For kind of completeness sake, I will also mention that the move bishop c7 immediately actually makes a draw for black, because after bishop takes g7, we can play bishop f4, rook f4, and here rook e2, forcing the queen to take on d3, and then we take on f4, queen g3, knight g6, and this is somehow a draw. But yeah, once again, it's very nice to click on all these variations in this sort of safety and privacy of your own home. But at the board, you just think, he done goofed here. Bishop e6 is just winning. Whereas after bishop e6, black can more or less resign. Bishop g7, bishop f5, queen h6. We did see this during the live show. The obvious threat is bishop f6 here, followed by queen g7 mate. But black just goes rook e6 here. And we thought the only way to create mating threats here is to go rook h4, f6, and the king actually runs away. Ding played this reasonably quickly, to which Vishy more or less instantly replied bishop g7, h8. And black has to resign because there's just no defense against queen g7 mate. An incredibly beautiful final construction, which I think is not at all diminished by the fact that somewhere along the way the computer would have won this game for black. I think it's sort of completely irrelevant. And this remains a very, very nice attacking game by Vishy. In particular, considering how little time he had and how high the stakes were, because he did have to win this. So a very, very nice game by Vishy. And normally I would end the video here, but there is also one final diagram I want to show you, because it's a stunningly beautiful position you will not see very often. This is the position I want to show you. This is, as you can see on your screen, a game between Fabiano Caruana and Wesley So. Their classical game finished in a draw, and in the Armageddon, Fabi got a very, very large advantage out of the opening, let some of it slip, then got another advantage, I think let some of it slip again. And then they got to here. Black's last move is rook e7, e4. And here, white has an absolutely gorgeous shot that wins on the spot, which we completely failed to notice during the live show, but which was apparently spotted in a split second by MVL, who was at that moment, he was a guest in the studio on the official broadcast with Judith Polgar and Anna Rudolph. White can win here by playing queen e5. And this is just such a beautiful move to make. The point of it is, we establish the threat of c2, c4, and regardless of which piece black takes on e5 with, we end up with this position, either here or here. And also, quite relevantly, you cannot play, let's say, queen d1 here, because queen b8 is an immediate mate. What happened in the game is Fabi also established the threat of c4 check, and we thought for a second that he was just completely winning, because how do you stop c4 from happening? But the difference is, here Wesley played queen d1. And Fabi, to his absolute horror, realized that after c4, rook c4, bc4, king takes c4, the queen on h3 cannot actually give the black king a single check. Rook on f6 is also away from the game. And there's really no good way to avoid black at least giving a perpetual here. Once again, it's an Armageddon, so it doesn't really matter if black is winning here. It matters that the perpetual is unstoppable. So in this position, the queen had to go back, and after that, Fabi never really came close to winning this position. But once again, queen e5 is on seconds potentially, and I'm not exactly sure what Fabi's clocks were showing at this point. But in the heat of battle, it's very, very easy to miss it. But I wanted to show you this position because it's extremely picturesque, and I think any kind of a round report which didn't mention it wouldn't be doing you justice as the viewers. And on that point, I will start wrapping this video up. Let's briefly have a look at the standings. There it is, the situation after the 4 rounds. Magnus continues leading after winning a very topsy-turvy Armageddon against Shahmatyarov. He was much better out of the opening, then completely equal, then once again much better, then completely equal, and then finally Shah blundered mate with checks in a completely messy position in which the black king kind of made all the way to c4 and b3 and so on. Wesley is in second, having survived this queen e5 shot from Fabiano and not lost his Armageddon. And Yuangi is in third, having actually won his classical game against Alexander Grishuk, who in a very kind of sneaky fashion got outplayed. He was white in a Petrov and got what seemed like a very, very nice, very pleasant position, and then sort of gradually lost control and got outplayed and lost. So a very nice victory for Yuangi. Liren loses his tiebreak to Anand, but basically apart from the top 3, nobody's doing exceptionally well, and we have an absolute nightmare there at the bottom of the table. 2 classical losses and 2 losses in Armageddon for Grishuk, and MVL today slightly improved his fortunes by beating Levon Aronian in an Armageddon, but still continues to struggle. And this wraps up this video dealing with the highlights of round 4 of Norway chess. Once again, I would like to remind you that there is a number of deals in place if you want to watch the live shows we do every day with Jan Gustafsson from the studio, covering every single game from beginning till end. There is this deal if you just want to kind of dip your toe in the water and get yourself 1 month of premium. There's also this deal, which is slightly longer, and also very importantly, there are now hoodies to be had, and who doesn't like hoodies? Come on. On that point, once again, thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope to see at least some of you tomorrow during the live show. Bye bye.